Is an experience fuel to heal the soul with real talk and deep dives into hidden mental and emotional valleys and steep peaks of what ails and hinders us from thriving far and beyond surviving. This is a show to awaken the sleeping giants and hidden phenomenal in all of us. R&R. Welcome. You've entered the space to release and rediscover. R&R with Topazz is an experience fuel to heal the soul with real talk and deep dives into hidden mental and emotional valleys and steep peaks of what ails and hinders us from thriving far and beyond surviving. This is a show to awaken the sleeping giants and hidden phenomenal in all of us. R&R. Welcome. Entered the space to release and rediscover. R&R with Topazz is an experience fuel to heal the soul with real talk and deep dives into hidden mental and emotional valleys and steep peaks of what ails and hinders us from thriving far and beyond surviving. This is a show to awaken the sleeping giants and hidden phenomenal in all of us. R&R. Welcome. Well, good evening. Good evening. This is Topazz, and you are watching R&R with Topazz. It is the Monday mindset, the mind matter issues. Every Monday night, right here on CTN Media. That's right, this is Black Media, where we are changing the narrative. CTN Media is powered by the Black Business Initiative. That's right, with several shows that you can check out during the week. Tomorrow, of course, is Seven Generations Black at 4 p.m. And on Wednesday at 10 a.m., you have the resource report every week. So make sure that you tune in. Thank you for joining us this evening. We'll give some people a chance to come on into the space. As most of you probably know, this is National Sex Abuse Awareness Month. And having been a sex offender therapist, an approved provider, an expert, and I say that humbly, but I was deemed an expert. Actually, nationwide, I was on the executive board for the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers for, I think 6 years. I was the Colorado chapter president for Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, otherwise known as ATSA, for 2 years, and have addressed audiences nationwide from London to Montreal and Saipan and various states here locally. So I've also authored a couple of chapters in books put out by the Safe Society Press Association, related to the issue of sexual abuse and sex offender treatment. So I would be remiss if I didn't dedicate at least one of my episodes to the issue of sexual abuse this month. Every year, April, the same time, it is National Sex Abuse Awareness Month. So I want to warn you in advance, or not so much warn you, but just prepare you for a heavy topic this evening. If you are a survivor, if you are maybe in a situation where you're currently being abused, we do have some information for you. A phone number that you can call if you know of someone who does need support for victimization. There is a crisis number that you can call, and we will get that up on the screen in just a moment, where you can get 24-hour access to crisis care. The Trauma Center, which is right here in Denver. Their crisis number is 303-894-8000. And if you are looking for a therapist, you're interested in getting into counseling, then of course you can consider my agency, Rediscovery Through Wellness. And you can text 303-801-8052. It says 25, but it's actually 52. You can text to schedule an appointment for a 30-minute teleconsult for free. So I just want to put that up there up front. So last week we talked about trauma. And so I wanted to just kind of share a little bit of information that I didn't get to last week. As I mentioned, trauma is something that I could dedicate 8 episodes easily just to trauma. Sexual abuse obviously is one area of trauma. In the late 90s, the CDC and Kaiser got together and did some research. I'm going to offer a little bit of data. I know that sometimes this data stuff can be boring, but I want to just kind of set the tone with some factual information. They did some research, and through that process, determined that of the 7 most deadly causes of diseases and death, I said deadly, but high risk conditions, 7 out of 10 leading causes of death in the US, that actually does affect brain development, immune systems, and can actually have an influence on our physiological responses, our DNA, and how it's read and transcribed. People who are exposed to this condition are do present with a higher risk of various medical conditions, and this condition that I'm describing is not, it's not COVID, it's not cancer, it's not some immune deficiency, although it contributes to immune deficiency, and that issue is trauma. That's right, trauma in and of itself is one of the most, in the 7 top most deadly conditions that contributes to death or terminal illness. And so people who are exposed to high doses of trauma have at a triple rate of risk to lung cancer, heart disease, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. Now, what level of trauma am I talking about? I'm not talking about the low end of the spectrum where you flunk a test or lose your job. I'm not talking about that level of trauma, although depending on who you are and what that job meant to you, if your livelihood and everything is contingent upon keeping that job, that could certainly score somewhere in the mid-range of trauma. But what I'm talking about with regard to this specific trauma is abuse, various kinds of abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, those areas of trauma, and vicarious trauma. We talked about that last week, witnessing trauma, that this is serious business, folks. This is serious business. The work that this study that was done with CDC and Kaiser was specific to looking at the adverse childhood experiences that contribute to ACEs. Some of you may be familiar with ACEs, and ACEs. They were looking at the specific areas of trauma, which included substance dependency, domestic violence, incarceration, physical and emotional neglect, parental mental illness, sexual abuse, and physical abuse. Those were the specific areas that they were looking at that correlated with depending on how many areas people scored at, because as it turned out, 67% of the people who participated in this assessment and later studies show that at least 67% of the population experienced at least one area in which they could score yes to any of these areas that I just mentioned. Again, domestic violence, incarceration, physical, emotional neglect, parental mental illness, physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, substance dependency, and I'm going to add murder to that. When you witness murder or are a survivor of mass murder, people who scored 3 or more of those areas, that begins to increase the propensity for these various illnesses, which include chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, hepatitis, depression, suicidality, lung cancer, and ischemic heart disease. So I wanted to just kind of lay that out first, because we were talking about post-traumatic slave disorder last week, or in some instances, it's referred to as post-traumatic slave syndrome. When we look at that and what you learned last week, we know that many in our communities can check off the boxes for at least 2 or more of these areas, which increase a person's risk for high risk behavior. So I just kind of wanted to lay that out for starters. We're going to zero in on sexual abuse specifically this evening, because when I looked at this ACEs research, and I looked at the fact that people who experience more than one of these traumas are at greater risk of being a victim to one of these health conditions, in addition to a higher risk of engaging in some type of behavior that either puts themselves in danger or puts others in danger, it has a significant impact on our communities and our children. So I want to just pause there for a moment, and I want to show you a clip.
My name is Casey Pope, and I'm a survivor of childhood molestation. Oh, is that gonna be hard for you? When I was first molested, I was 12 years old. I went through some things with my dad. He would fondle me, he would touch me in ways that I knew was inappropriate. The breaking point for me was he came up behind me and just started touching on me. He pushed me on the floor, and he got on top of me, and he stopped.
When I first received the call, I was in shock. I just couldn't understand. I mean, how could someone do this? I had a guilt that all of this time it was like this was happening and I didn't know it.
In high school, I was very angry, very depressed. I felt like I just couldn't take it anymore. I took like 50 plus pills, and I felt myself like getting weak and weaker.
Okay, I wanted to start with this video because I'm starting with children and looking at this ACEs study. Early adversity in children affects the young brains and bodies of our young children in pleasure, as it relates to the areas of our brain or their brain that affects pleasure and rewards the brain center. And so it affects a person's response or ability to respond to situations directly related to our flight or fight syndrome. We know that the specific areas of the brain, the amygdala, affects the fear response. That's the fear response center. And so trauma can, repeated experiences of trauma in early childhood can have damaging effects on brain development, hormonal development, and it also affects the immune system. And so it's one thing to have a fight or flight syndrome when it's appropriate, an adaptive response, I should say. That's how the brain is set up to help us to adapt to dangerous situations. So if you're in the woods and there's a bear and you have this flight or fight synapses in your brain that gives you the energy and the adrenaline that you need to respond appropriately or effectively to save your life, that's one thing. But what about if you're dealing with that bear every single day? If that bear is coming home with you, or you happen to hear that bear in the room and you don't know, is the bear coming out of the room today, or is the bear going to stay in the room today? But you hear the bear growling constantly. What you just heard in the video was an adult woman who is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. There are a lot of folks that have determined that because their abuse happened when they were a child or years ago, that they don't need support, or they are managing it or maintaining it effectively. They don't need to do anything in addition to address it. But if you've never addressed that trauma, there is a continuous effect in terms of how you respond to similar situations, or a fear that this is a similar, it could have a similar outcome. Something triggers you, something reminds you of that traumatic moment. This young woman in the video did not address her abuse until later in life. And fortunately for her, she had a mother who responded, who was in shock and denial at first, but did eventually take the proper steps to support her daughter in the abuse. But we also know that there are many situations out there where the parents are not responding to protect their children, not just the parents, but the adults who are in positions as caretakers or overseers for vulnerable persons. And they get this information and they don't do anything to support their children. We have too many children that are victims of sexual abuse. We have children that are being abused by other children. In 2019, I had several cases where we had young elementary age children that were being abused by other children in the bathroom, on the playground, and even in the classroom. And the school's response to that was very inappropriate. It was either extreme in one case where a 10-year-old was handcuffed and arrested, and then we had on the low end of the continuum where there was no response to getting these children the attention or getting them the help that they need. And we as a community really need to take a look at how we are responding to our children who are in danger, or who are children who are crying out for help, children who are being victimized and exhibiting all kinds of symptoms that they're being hurt. So I want to just talk about a few of those symptoms for parents to be aware of. Be aware of a change in your child's affect, their personality shifts, where all of a sudden they're not there themselves. Maybe they're usually very talkative and now they're more withdrawn, or they're withdrawn, but now they're overly talkative, because children will engage in various compensatory behaviors to try to cover up or hide what's happened. Because more often than not, when we're talking about abusers who are sexually abusing young children, they are instilling fear in those children to get them to not report, or they're convincing the child that this is normal behavior that is really okay. And they sell the child on the idea that what is happening to them is normal, that it's not a big deal. It's okay if it hurts. It's supposed to hurt. And that is a message that will come from the abuser, be the abuser another child or be the abuser an adult. But more often than not, when it's another child, that we consider to be sexually reactive behavior, because that other child has probably been a victim or exposed to sexual abuse themselves. And there needs to be a response to get those children help. We have to get out of this mode of what's done in the home stays in the home. That's not helping anyone. Make sure that you're getting the proper support and treatment, counseling that is specifically designed to address the issues that your child is having. As a Christian myself, I certainly, and a prayer warrior, I support and believe in prayer wholeheartedly. However, just praying over the situation is not enough. You need to get the appropriate intervention, and taking them to a church counselor who is not licensed or who is not an expert in the area of treatment for a particular issue is not satisfactory either. We have too many pastors or ministers who are double dipping in the sense that their call is to preach or to do pastoral care. That does not necessarily include therapy or counseling. Now, there are some who have gone to school for that and they do have a gift in that area, but don't just assume that taking your child to a therapist or to a pastor is going to take care of it. And I agree, parents need to participate in counseling also, not just the child, absolutely, for many reasons. Sometimes to deal with the trauma that the parent is now exposed to because their child has been sexually abused, and to deal with a lot of times their response to the child who has been exposed to sexual abuse. So I was talking about the symptoms, what to look for with your children, extreme personality changes, attitude, eating, their eating habits change. A lot of time, children who are in their primary ages after they've already come out of that whole bedwetting stage will start bedwetting again. That's not an automatic indicator, but oftentimes young children who are being sexually abused will start bedwetting. Sometimes a symptom that we've seen to be consistent with young children is also fire setting, playing with matches, being mean to or cruel to animals, or even insects, burning insects, anything associated with torturing. Exhibiting lots of angry behaviors that don't necessarily fit with their personality. Don't try to do an assessment on your own based on what I'm describing, but get a professional who can do an assessment on your child. What's happening with their grades? Are their grades suddenly looking different? Again, sometimes it may be an extreme on the uphill side of the continuing because they're trying to cover up. They don't want to draw attention to themselves. So now they're trying to be the super good child, but that's not necessarily who they are. That's not their personality. So if you're noticing, yes, good one, Claudette, sleeping in their clothes, but not only sleeping in their clothes, but layering their clothes. A lot of times, victims will layer their clothes, or they'll start wearing really baggy clothes. They want to hide. They'll start wearing hats. They start wearing jackets a lot, and they're zipped up. And even when it's hot outside, they've got a coat on. They've got a hat on. They're really trying to hide. They're trying to layer themselves. They're trying to protect themselves through these layers of clothing. Their sleeping habits change. They have a hard time sleeping, don't want to go to bed, don't want to be in the space where the abuse happened. Maybe they don't want to go in their room anymore. They want to sleep on the couch, or they want to sleep with a sibling. They don't want to get in the bathtub. They don't want to go in the bathroom. Wherever the abuse occurred, a lot of times they want to avoid that. If you notice that the child is starting to become promiscuous, masturbating, touching themselves, to some extent, that is appropriate, age-appropriate behavior because they're self-discovery. But they will become, or they can become really compulsive in that behavior and touching themselves and doing it openly and anywhere they start to touch themselves. They may start to regress and in their behavior and start baby talking and crawling and doing things that are inappropriate for their age. So that gives you some idea of what to look for from younger children who may be experiencing some level of sexual abuse. Sexual abuse does not always have to be hands-on. It may be something that they're witnessing, someone exposing them to pornography, someone forcing them to watch someone else engage in in sexual behaviors. And a lot of times them forcing the child to watch is really in preparing them to be next. That's a form of grooming that person for what's to come. Predators and pedophiles look for a particular victim type. They have a personality type that they're looking for, and they will hang out where children are and just sit back and watch for a while and look for the child that seems to be a loner, the child that doesn't necessarily fit in, or they look for victims that are experience low self-esteem, trying to find themselves, or if they can determine that this child is already being abused in some other way, physically abused, emotionally abused, because then they'll step in to try to fill the void. So we're going to move on from that. I want to just pause for a moment and see if we have any questions. If there's anyone out there that has any concerns thus far, make sure that you put your concerns in the chat. If there's a child that you're concerned about, it may not even be your own child, it may be someone else's child, and you need some support or would like more information, again, call the number on the screen, 303-801-8052. And that is the number for Rediscovery Through Wellness. And you can text that number so that you can get a free 30-minute consult. The Crisis Center is available 24 hours a day, or the Trauma Center for their crisis hotline, 303-894-8000. And that is a local program here in Denver, and they do offer a lot of free services specifically for victims of abuse. So I want to just pause for a moment and talk about what is sexual abuse. It is contact without, and contact, again, doesn't have to be hands-on, but it's a sexual experience or encounter without consent. So, what is consent? First of all, in order to consent, there has to be equal power, equal knowledge, and equal resources. So, for example, if the age is the same, or they're within a 4-year age proximity, power differential could make this an inappropriate situation because it's a boss, a superior, someone who has authority over that person. When we talk about knowledge, when we talk about power, it's a power base too. There needs to be equal power and control. So if we're talking about someone who's under the influence of alcohol and you take advantage of that person, maybe that person's older than you, but that person was under the influence and they were not in a position to consent. If the person has some special needs, low functioning, and the other person grooms them and coerces them into some type of sexual act, then there is no consent there. If the person has some foreknowledge of what their intent is through this sexual act, then there is not consent because the person had no idea. For example, you're on a date and you think you're going to dinner and that's going to be the extent of the evening, but the other person all along, their intent was to take advantage of you or to get you in a position to where now you owe them for whatever they did for you in their mind that now makes them eligible to have some type of sexual encounter with you. But whatever the power differentiation is, it may be strength, it may be wisdom. They can outsmart you, they manipulate you, they gaslight you. A spouse can rape their partner. A lot of times people don't realize that. If you're in a marriage, you can be raped by your significant other. You can be sexually abused just like you can be physically abused. No means no, it does not, and A lack of a no does not mean yes. Make sure that there is a clear understanding and a clear response from the adult partner that this is something that they are in agreement with all the way through. So one person doesn't get to decide, well, this is happening because now you got me all hot and bothered. Now you've got me all aroused, horny, I've got an erection, or I'm wet, whatever the case may be. When the other person decides that they no longer want to participate and they say stop, they say, no, I don't want to do this, you're hurting me, you need to be paying attention and it needs to stop. If you continue to press past the communication efforts of that individual who is saying to you that they're not comfortable, that they're not okay with continuing to engage in this encounter, then you have lost consent. In some instances, maybe the one person has consented to intercourse, but they are not okay with anal sex. But you've decided that, well, we started, and so we're going forward. If you move past that, they've only consented to vaginal intercourse, and you decide that anal sex is what's going to be happening, then that now becomes rape or any other act outside of what that person is comfortable with. You are now shifting from consensual intercourse or consensual sex to rape. The moment you start to push that person in a direction that they don't want to be in, even if you're already actively engaged, if you don't stop and the person is asking you to stop, you need to stop, because at that point it becomes rape. Period. So if you know that you're not going to be able to discipline yourself, you're not going to be able to stop, you're not going to be able to listen and pay attention to what your partner is communicating, then you may not want to engage in that activity in the first place. The rape culture is such in this country now to where so many people feel like, they're entitled. There's this sense of entitlement of what you owe me or what you should give me. Well, you're walking around with that dress on, you're walking around with those skinny jeans on, you're walking around this. So yeah, of course I smacked your butt. Of course I grabbed your titty, or, whatever the case may be. We're all hanging out. You had on this low clip. Stop it, folks. Stop putting your hands on people that do not ask for it, or when I say ask for it, ask you to touch them or ask permission. Don't just go up touching people without asking. Is it okay? Are you comfortable? Are you okay? It's okay to check in with people during the course of engaging in whatever this sexual act is, making sure that somebody is not choking to death on your semen or whatever the case may be. Pay attention to your partner and meeting the needs. And again, if you can't slow yourself down enough to do that, you're probably not the person that should be engaging in the behavior. Now, there are different forms of sexual abuse. Not all sexual abuse is related, as I said earlier, to actual physical contact. We have voyeurs. A voyeur is someone who watches, who's watching you undress, who's watching you engage in various behaviors so that they can get off, and they get off on that. People have various fetishes. And again, if they don't have your consent, they don't have your permission to be watching you, then that is a form of sexual abuse. Voyeurism does qualify as a criminal act. It's usually a misdemeanor, but depending on what other details or what other dynamics may be involved in that, it could be a felony, but usually voyeur behavior is a misdemeanor. Obviously, now we've got sexting. people sending you pictures that you did not approve or ask for, people sending you pictures of their genitals or their naked body or sexual act without your consent is a form of sexual abuse. People making harassing sexual phone calls is a form of sexual abuse. Someone exposing themselves to you without your consent is a form of sexual abuse. You're walking in the park and someone walks up and exposes themselves, and nowadays people really get kind of slick with what they do, especially with all the sagging and less clothing. It really can be a form of sexual abuse. And when I would do evaluations, I would find out so much more beyond what the actual charge was that they were referred to me for. They may have been referred for a voyeur behavior or exposing, but through the evaluation, I find that the typology that presents through this forensic interview process, that they really are a much higher risk of an abuser. In fact, they qualify as a predator because they've engaged in many other more serious kinds of offenses that they never got caught for. They just got caught for this one. And there are different assessments that can provide information about varying risk factors or propensities for risk based on what people are aroused to, what they get power to, what gives them power, what gives them a sense of control. A lot of rapists in particular, it's not even always about the physical act as much as it is the power and control from many sexual abusers. It's about the control that they get from engaging in whatever their preferred act is. For a voyeur, the power and control is what arouses them seeing you without you realizing that they're watching you is what they get off on. The person who is exposing themselves is getting off on catching you off guard, the element of surprise, the shock, the anger, you being pissed off and out of control. Oh my God, that is what gives them their sense of control. And that's, there may be an exposure at that moment is when they experience an ejaculation based on the shock value. Some rapists never even use their own genitals, but they'll use foreign objects to rape someone, and they're getting off on that depending on what kind of rapist it is. So also, the one who, the offender that is probably the most undetected is the one who is engaging in frottage. Frottage is touching and it not being obvious that it was for sexual pleasure. So someone who's standing behind you in line and they rub up against you. They may rub up against you with their genitals. They may rub up against you with their buttocks. They may rub up against you with their hand. But it's hard to know, did you do that on purpose? What the heck just happened? That was off. That just didn't feel right. Why are you so close to me? So one of the nice things about social distancing is nobody has no business being all up on you like that. But those who really get off on frottage are the ones who probably end up being more dangerous because usually that behavior becomes more progressive. We know incest is engaging in some type of sexual act with a family member or a relative. And molestation is usually touching. It's an older person touching a younger person, but not always. It can be someone who is of the same age who's touching, fondling, without your consent. Now that's different from frottage, where someone is being sneaky in how they're touching, and then they stand there and look at you crazy. Like, what? But that didn't feel right, and they know exactly what they did and why they did it, and it was very intentional. Whereas someone who is a molester, where they're fondling, touching, maybe even some digital penetration, but they're not using their genitals, and that's usually for an offender who has not progressed beyond that point of molestation yet. They are getting off on the touching. It can be over the clothes or under the clothes, humping, all of that. And then there are fetishes. People with fetishes, a lot of times they're the ones who also go underreported because it's not obvious that this is sexual abuse. But if someone is using a foreign object or they're engaging in some kind of freaky behavior so that they can get off on that, then that is a form of sexual abuse. I had an adult client once who would molest his daughter's friends when they would spend the night. He would give them Benadryl. He would sneak Benadryl in their drinks. And then when they would go to sleep, he would start fondling their feet and he would be masturbating while he was fondling their feet. So people have various fetishes. There are all kinds of fetishes that people have. And again, because it's not obvious that, what's really going on, those people often get away with their abusive behavior for longer periods of time before getting caught or someone reporting them. So again, I want to pause for just a moment. If there are any other questions, we want to give you guys a chance to drop your comments or questions in the chat. We have to also look at the fact that women can be offenders as well. There are women who sexually abuse. There are women who rape. There are girls. We talked about sexually reactive children, and then we have adolescents who engage in various forms of sexual abuse. And there was one time in my practice where we had a group of probably about 10 girls between the ages of 12 and 14, 12 and 15 who were in this group. They were all babysitters. These were all girls who were babysitters who were molesting the children that they were babysitting for. I've had groups of adult women who had molested their children or grandchildren or someone else's child. But the biggest group of women that I've had where I was facilitating were women who were coming out of prison who were co-conspirators with a male partner or with another female partner who were involved in more sadistic kinds of sexual abuse behavior. So I want to make sure that I put emphasis on the fact that there are women and girls who also sexually abuse. This is not just a male thing where men are the only ones abusing. So that said, men are victims too. And it's not just in prison. That's not the only place that men are being raped. Boys are being raped. Adult men are being drugged and taken advantage of by other men who are grooming them to become a sexual partner. There are some gay men out there who go after straight men specifically. I had a guy who used to be my beautician, and he would sit there and tell me how he would just be on a mission to turn out a straight man. And again, if you're doing that, you don't without consent, and again, consent means equal knowledge, equal resources, equal power and control. And so if the person doesn't know what you're up to, then that is not consent. They don't know that you're setting them up to take advantage of them sexually. I had a girl once, an adolescent female who was experiencing some sexual identity. She was going through some identity crisis. And so She would present herself. She always went after girls at Skate City, and she would present herself as a male. And then she would groom these girls and then get them to a space, whether it was in the car or, you know, in either her or the victim's bedroom, and then take advantage of them sexually. And then when the girl finds out that this is another girl, then the girl's freaking out because they're thinking that this is a male. That qualifies as sexual abuse because, again, there's not equal power in that situation. There's not equal knowledge when you don't know what's happening. So I want to pause there and show our next clip. Because
let me tell y'all something. And this is one of the most serious things that I've ever said. Maybe even one of the most emotional and personal things that I've ever said. And it has to do with DMX and it has to do with his passing. But not only his passing, but his childhood and what he has went through. What we have went through. Now, my relationship with DMX, we wasn't super close, but we had time enough to be able to talk to each other. And coming from similar backgrounds, there's certain things that I need y'all to understand. When he, and this is not what somebody told me, this is what he said to me. He said, you know, when he was younger, his mom had took him to a children's home and said that they was just going to visit. And she left him there. She took him there and she left him there. And he was too little to be there. Too little to understand how to defend himself, how to take care of himself and everything else. But he did it. And he survived it. And we all have our ways of dealing with it. I've been through that system. I've been through that. I know what it's like when people think that adults don't care about children. I know what it's like to run the streets, sleep on the train, sleep in the hallways, try to sleep at friends' houses, have people tell you could come stay at their house and their brothers are trying to mess with you, or even their fathers and adults and uncles and shit. I know what it is like. And we all handle it differently. We all have our demons. When people would see me and say how angry I was, they didn't understand what I had endured and what I went through. And as soon as me and DMX came in contact with each other, as soon as me and Earl came in contact with each other, we already knew what was done to that spirit. And it makes you overly aggressive. It makes you seem angry to people. It makes you seem mad to people. So people try to find whatever they can in order to overcome that. Some people turn to drugs, some people turn to drinking, some people turn to other things. People wonder why we give so much, the money that I make now, right? I give most of my money away to children.
What you didn't hear in that video were the specifics, but I think that you can pretty much make the determination. It's obvious. Part of what was being alluded to was the fact that DMX was a victim of various forms of abuse as a child. He talked openly about being introduced to crack by someone who tricked him into smoking a blunt that had crack in it. But he also talks about having been physically abused, sexually abused, and neglected, emotionally neglected, abandoned as a child. And I wanted to show that video just from the standpoint of really putting emphasis on the potential for lifelong impact when there is not the appropriate intervention, when there is not the appropriate treatment or support to address and to help a person work through whatever the trauma is that they've been exposed to. It is critical that we as a community, the Black community in particular, communities of color, we have got to do a better job. And I'm putting that in there because I know that in many communities of color, there really is not even the space to talk about sexual abuse, to talk about sex, period, not even healthy sex. But in our communities as Black folks, if we did a better job of talking about what is healthy sex versus what is not, and really educating our children and stop treating sex as though it's this horrible thing, because even as Christians, God intended sex to be a beautiful experience, a beautiful encounter. It's not an ugly thing, and it's not just for procreation. And a lot of times the church would give the message to young people that's why they're not supposed to have sex when they're not married, because it's for procreation. And that's not what God intended. But moving on from that, we have to do a better job of being more open in talking about what sex is, and talking about our bodies and being more comfortable with our bodies and giving our children permission to ask questions and not reacting. If your child starts asking you questions, then guess what? That means they've already been exposed to something, even if it was just through conversation and with social media being what it is. A lot of times we're not monitoring children and what they have access to the way that we should be. And sometimes we just don't even have the software or the technical savvy to monitor things the way that we might want to. And so who knows what these babies are being exposed to. Sit down and have conversations with your children. Sit down and talk about it as a family. I started this out talking about trauma, talking about the impacts of early adversity for children, what our children are exposed to. I talked about the aces, and the more check boxes that there are on that assessment, the higher risk for or the greater risk for high risk behavior, as well as for health conditions. Does everybody who is sexually abused end up sexually abusing or raping someone? Absolutely not. Has every sex offender out there been raped or sexually abused? No. That used to be the belief that they were all sexually abused themselves. However, anyone who is sexually abusing has definitely been exposed to some form of abuse. It may not have been sexual, but it is some form of abuse. And now this individual is choosing to use sex as a weapon. They've weaponized sex. And weaponized their charisma or their charm in order to groom victims, if that's the kind of offender we're talking about, or it may be an offender who is very violent and aggressive in their abuse. But either way, it's time to start talking about the fact that abuse exists in our communities. It probably exists somewhere in your bloodline, in your family history. Maybe not in your immediate family, but in most cases, you've got a relative who's been sexually abused. You may even have a child who's been sexually abused. It may be you yourself. But if you have not taken the steps to get the appropriate support and the help, then you're probably not going to be in the best position to walk your children or another family through that process until you get the help that you need. Your sex life, your experience in making love and having sex is going to be a much more pleasurable experience if you can work through your own trauma. That's one of the benefits of working through the trauma, so that you're not carrying that toxicity into your intimate experiences, your intimate relationships. So please, please take the time to get the appropriate help that you need and stop carrying the shame. It's time to speak out, to share the stories so that other people know that they're not alone and that their family situation is not isolated to that family situation. We have to stop carrying this thing in top secret form. And again, getting the appropriate help, and stop thinking that you can fix it. If there's incest in your family, if you don't have the expertise, if you don't have the experience, punishing your child is not going to be enough to stop them from engaging in the behavior. If you have a child who's already started acting out sexually, if you're someone who has taken advantage of someone sexually, who is an abuser, you need help. It's not going to go away by itself. We've, again, going back to my time as a sex offender therapist, when that was the population that I worked with, which was over 17 years that I worked with just solely various sex offenders, including the first community-based rape program for rapists coming out of DOC and on parole. But I was going to say that we had a grandfather group. We had a grandfather group at the agency that I was working at the time. That grandfather group was one of the largest groups that we had. That was men who were over the age of 55 who were in that group. Most of those men had been offending and abusing since they were adolescents. And it continued. They may have taken a hiatus for a while, and then they started sexually abusing their grandchildren. They were abusing their own children when those children were young, and nobody intervened, nobody reported, nobody did anything. And then when the grandchildren came along, they started abusing the grandchildren. And there were a few grandmothers who were in that age group, in a separate group as well. Same kind of thing. They were acting out younger, and then they started acting out when the grandchildren came along, or when they started, when they had access to nieces and nephews. If you know that you have a problem, whether you're the offender or whether you're the victim, there is help. There are experts. There are people who specialize in this work. Regardless of what the source is, where it came from, we know that we as a people, as far as Black folks in America, were the subject to such heinous sex crimes, such heinous sexual violence throughout slavery and beyond, that this thing became perpetuated and almost solidified in our culture, in that it was normalized to a certain extent to almost expect that somebody was going to be raped and taken advantage of, forced to watch your mother or your wife or your husband or son be damaged sexually, go through some violent act of sexual abuse over and over again. I talked about the flight or fight piece earlier, and what happens through trauma and the amygdala of the brain, and how all of this processing affects us and damages brain development. And I talked about specifically, I didn't get to finish my point, but talked about the bear and that flight or fight. That natural organic response is an adaptive response, but when it becomes maladaptive is when it has to be used over and over again, because that bear is in the house. It's not in the woods. It wasn't that one-time thing, but that bear is in the house where they live, or that bear shows up to visit once a month, once a week. That bear lives next door or down the street. That bear is the babysitter. That bear is the uncle or the aunt. That bear is the foster parent. who's raping those foster children. When a child has to learn at an early age, but even for an adult who has to force their brain and their heart to respond to that level of trauma continuously, eventually it begins to erode the system. And that's when it becomes a medical problem, becomes an emotional problem, and a mental problem. And sometimes, even though it may have stopped 10 years ago, the memories, the intrusive memories, the nightmares, the physiological reactivity, the muscle memory, the heart memory, the trauma bonding, it's still there. And the reactivity is still there. There has to be the work done to disrupt that process. And we as a community have to stop protecting abusers, no matter who it is. Your favorite celebrity, your favorite uncle, your favorite politician, your best friend. We have to stop protecting abusers. We have to start paying closer attention to outcries from our children, from adults, from our relatives, from our community. We have to do a better job. Yes, are there false allegations out there? Absolutely. Are there people with false reports? Absolutely. But more than false reports are real reports, and reports from people who may have waited 10 years to report. That does not dilute the reality of their experience and what they went through. That does not minimize the seriousness of it, nor does it erode their credibility. So we got to stop that BS as well. Stop judging people because they waited so long to report. There are all kinds of reasons why a person may not have reported at the time. So what had happened a year ago? So what had happened 2 years ago? Does that mean that, okay, well, I guess you got to shake it off and roll with it. Sorry, too bad, so sad. No, that is not who we are. When they're ready, when they feel safe enough, when they feel courageous enough, when they feel brave enough, when they feel the support, when they have the clarity, when they realize the inappropriateness of what happened, maybe then is when they decide, okay, maybe because someone else reported first and that's given them permission. Maybe now it's no longer blocked or suppressed or hidden somewhere, buried beneath all the other things they've done to overcompensate, to try to hide from that trauma. But we've got to stop beating people up because they've waited. They didn't come and report immediately when it happened. That does not mean it didn't happen. And then lastly, we got to start believing our boys too, and we've got to start supporting our men who have been victims of sexual abuse. And stop minimizing and dressing up boys being molested by women. That is one of the ugliest and most insensitive, disrespectful, dehumanizing things that we can do, is try to celebrate this and force this young man to look at it like you've got a feather in your cap because that 30-year-old woman came onto you and jumped on you and or fondled you or had sex with you. That's rape. That qualifies as rape. Having been an expert witness in the Letourneau case, one of the first cases that came out with a teacher in Seattle who was having sex with her student who was 14 years old at the time, and she ended up getting pregnant and going to prison and then getting out on parole and getting pregnant again. Yeah, it's real. But this little boy who saw it as, wow, this is great. My teacher wants me. This grown woman who's married with children, she's going to leave her husband for me. Clearly, she had some mental illness. Clearly, she was suffering from some severe issues. There's nothing cute about that. And to all you brothers out there who are, telling your sons to suck it up, stop it. You're causing more damage to an already damaged psyche. The confusion, because he didn't want to do it in the first place, but he went with it because in his head, this is what daddy would want me to do, or this is what my boys would want me to do. And that's why we've got so many of our Black boys right now and Black men all jacked up, because we're not supporting them in their abuse. Believe victims, believe women, believe Black women, believe Black men, believe our children, our babies, because sexual abuse is real and it is rampant in our community. And it is the pink elephant that's crushing everything in the room. And it's time for us to acknowledge that pink elephant and disturb its rummaging and it's stomping and it's overpowering and it's damaging. You got to call that pink elephant out for what it is, so that we can take control back of this situation that is rampant. It's out of control. But we can slow this thing down, number one, by acknowledging that it's happening, holding people accountable, getting treatment and getting support. And holding them accountable is not about defaming people and putting them on the block for everybody to shame them. Because abusers, offenders, however you want to look at it, need help too. If we don't break the cycle from the abuser, then we're not protecting the victims or the would-be victims. This is Topazz with R&R with Topazz, and thank you for tuning in this evening. We're here every Monday night. Support Black media, and you can support them with making donations to CTN Media. CTN Media is changing the narrative. This is Black media, sponsored by BBI. Again, this is Topazz. I'm here on Monday nights at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Invite your friends to join us. Next week, we'll be talking about narcissistic relationships, getting out of narcissistic relationships, what is required to recover from that, whether it was your parent, whether it's an intimate partner, whether it's a boss, employer, but recovering from narcissistic relationships will be our topic next week. Thank you for tuning in. Again, this is R&R with Topazz. Peace and blessings. Breathe, breathe. Let's put that number up, those numbers up one more time before we go. If you are in crisis, you're a victim right now, well, we've got Rediscovery Through Wellness up there. So if you are looking for a therapist, you want counseling, you can contact 303-801-8052, Rediscovery Through Wellness. Text that number, schedule an appointment for a free 30-minute consult so we can get you into some treatment. And if the right match for you is not at Rediscovery Through Wellness, guess what? There are so many qualified Black therapists in Denver these days. We can get you to the right one. All right. And then if you're in crisis right now, you need help immediately, call 303-894-8000, 24-hour hotline for the Trauma Center, Black-owned trauma center here in Denver that offers free services to victims of abuse. Again, have a good night. This is R&R with Topazz. Breathe.
Malcolm X once said, if you're not careful, the newspaper will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. Look around you. What do you see? I think Malcolm X was right.
The reality of today is whatever the media keeps on feeding you. Let me tell you another fact. In 2013, 77% of media stations were owned by white Americans, while only 0.6 were owned by Black Americans. It's not hard to understand why Black Americans are seen in a negative light every time you turn on the news.
Welcome to CTN Media, a Black-owned company dedicated to bringing attention and addressing the core issues that profoundly affect the lives of so many underrepresented and underserved population in the United States. We know that the mainstream media is a propaganda tool often used against our communities, portraying a skewed view of Blackness. It's time we change the narrative.
CTN Media is the voice for the voiceless, presenting the dynamic perspectives our community deserves.
CTN Media has invested in bringing you unbought and unbossed perspectives. We are now raising $20,000 to expand the CTN Media platform and an additional $30,000 to expand our National Black Media Coalition.
Be a part of the process, because the revolution will be televised. In our way, with our voice, with our narrative.